Greetings, everyone, and welcome to God Save the King. I am your host, Tim Keyes, and I want to thank you for joining me on the Truth Be Told radio network, where you can hear my show every Friday night at 10 p.m. Eastern Time. Now, as my manner is, I'm very excited about today's show, but let's get a couple of things out of the way first. First, if you appreciate content like this, you know how this works. This is social media. If you would please go to my Facebook page, my YouTube channel, give me a like, subscribe, go to my website, which is www.godsavetheking.org, and sign up for my newsletter. That really helps me continue to bring content like this to you, the listeners of my show and the listeners on the Truth Be Told radio network. So, smash that like button, hit subscribe. You know how that works. We really appreciate that. Secondarily, for those of you that may never have heard my show before, let's very briefly recount, what is God Save the King? Well, God Save the King, very simply, is retelling the nativity story. Well, the first thing you're noticing is you're going, well, Tim, this is July. Didn't the nativity take place in December? And unfortunately, no, it didn't. And that's a big part of why I am retelling the nativity story, is because the traditional nativity story that we are used to hearing is, in fact, Christian mythology. Now, that may sound offensive. It's certainly not intended to be offensive. But the reason I have come to call it Christian mythology is because it has just too many fundamental errors that change the fundamental nature of the story, and therefore the message, and frankly, therefore the theology behind the nativity story, right? So I don't want to go in depth, but I do want to give you an example. A big part of the traditional nativity story is this idea that Jesus was born in a stable. Well, Scripture tells us that he was laid in a manger, not that he was born in a stable. Those are not the same thing. The word stable is never mentioned. It never says born in a stable. It only says laid in a manger. Now, what is a manger? Well, a manger is a food trough for animals. And where do you find a manger? Well, logically, in most people's head, you would find a manger in or near a stable. So it's not an entirely illogical conclusion, but it is nonetheless a misinterpretation. And the reason it's a misinterpretation is because we don't understand Judean culture, the culture that it would have taken place in. We transport it into Western culture instead of Eastern culture, right? And then there's also a mistranslation of the Greek word kataluma. The Greek word kataluma does not mean a motel. So when we are told that Mary laid him in a manger because there was no room in the kataluma, that is typically translated inn, meaning a commercial traveler's inn or a motel. But that's not what that word means. That word means a guest room in a private home. So he was laid in a manger because there was no room in the guest room. And in traditional Judean architecture, the stable, quote unquote, wasn't a separate building. The stable was in the house. And therefore, the manger would also be in the house. And frankly, the manger would be in the living room. And they simply didn't stay in the guest room because the guest room was already taken, but they did stay in the large common room of a traditional Judean home. So Jesus was born in a traditional Judean home. He was not born in a stable. Joseph and Mary were not outcasts. Sorry. But that is a really good example of why we need to retell the nativity story, is because we need to rescue truth from familiarity. The traditional nativity story is so familiar that what I just mentioned to most people is going to be, oh my God, that just, they're going to react with incredulity. They're going to say, no, that can't possibly be. That can't possibly be correct. We've been celebrating Christmas on December 25th, and Jesus was born in a stable for 2,000 years. Well, unfortunately, that's not actually true either. It hasn't been for 2,000 years. It's been a lot less than that. depending upon exactly what perspective you're looking from. And then, of course, the December 25th birth date, that is inaccurate as well. Jesus was not born on December 25th. He was not born in December. He was not born in the winter. He was born in the fall. He was born in the month of September on the Gregorian calendar. He was born in the Hebrew month of Tishri, according to the Hebrew calendar. And that's actually what is really important. But that is all. You can find all of that in other episodes, and I don't want to go too deep into a review or too deep of telling you what God Save the King is all about, because I don't want to distract from what I want to get to today. Now, for the past 2 episodes, I've entitled these episodes Argumentum Ex Silentio, and Argumentum Ex Silentio is Latin for arguments from silence. And this is actually very important because this brushes up against how historical research actually works. Because historical research, and we talk about this in the past 2 episodes, so this is a little bit of a review, how historical research actually works is that historical research is always fragmentary. It's always fragmentary. And what we mean by that is that it always lacks the degree of evidence that we would like to find, okay? Because what we would love to find if we're trying to investigate a historical event, right? So that could be, let me just pick a couple of historical events at random, right? Well, what about the gunfight at OK Corral, right? What about the battle at Sterling Bridge, okay? What about, let's pick another one here. What's another one? What about the battle at Sterling Bridge? What about, who cares, right? But you get the idea there. I just picked a couple of historical events at random and I didn't actually pick them at random. They're stuck in my head because if you were to ever watch a television documentary about the OK Corral, the gunfight at the OK Corral, Wyatt Earp and his brothers and the Clanton gang, right? Inevitably, probably within the first 10 minutes of the show, you would get either the host of the show or a content expert would say something like this. And same is true for the Battle of Sterling Bridge, okay? You'd get a content expert who would say, well, the traditional story that we're used to hearing goes something like this, but the truth is probably more something like this. And the nativity is no different. The traditional story, and that I like to call it the tradition trap. The traditional story goes like this, but the reality, the truth probably goes more like this. And that's because tradition tends to take on a life of its own. When we start telling a tradition and then we start embellishing that tradition without doing our due diligence to discover if that's really what happened or not, then the tradition takes on a life of its own and we run into the tradition trap, because then we get stuck in that tradition. Because when you get told the tradition often enough, it gets embedded in our collective psyche, and then when you decide to challenge that tradition, you look like a kook, right? Now, I actually like the title kook because that means a keeper of odd knowledge, and I am definitely a kook when it comes to that definition. I know a lot about the nativity that most people would never know in a million years. And frankly, that's why I am here, because the real nativity story, get ready, the real nativity story is better. Okay, I get a lot of people who respond to my teaching and say, oh, but you're taking away my favorite part of the story. Well, if you'll listen for a second and you'll listen to what I'm saying, the real nativity story is actually much better than the traditional nativity story. And that is because although the broad strokes may remain generally true, the truth is in the details. The truth is in the details. And like I said, Jesus was laid in a manger, but he was not born in a stable. And those two things are not the same. So coming back to the title of the last 2 episodes plus today, Argumentum Ex Silentio, Arguments from Silence, parts 1, 2, and 3, is because the science and the art of historical investigation is that we don't have complete information, and we need to fill in the blanks as best we can. And that takes skill. That takes real skill, because the unfortunate habit is to fill in the blank with, frankly, whatever we want. And that's the problem, is we tend to fill in the blank with whatever we want, when what we really need to do is investigate the historical evidence we have and build our case of what that legitimately would have looked like. And in the last two episodes, I really took you through at least a little bit. I took you through the development of the mythology, of the development of the tradition about the three wise men, or the three kings, Gaspar, Melchior, and Balthasar, who, according to tradition, and I say that in air quotes, according to tradition, came from Persia, Arabia, and India, when that is not likely what happened at all. So what I've been trying to answer from silence, because it's not mentioned to the degree that we would like it to be, is, well, who were the Magi? Who were the Magi, and what did that Parthian ambassadorial entourage that scared the heck out of King Herod when they arrived in Jerusalem, what would that have looked like? See, so that's my goal here, at least in part, is to give you a much better description and definition of who the Magi were and what that would have looked like. And the reason it fits into our overarching subject here of arguments from silence is that the biblical, very conspicuous record of the massacre of the innocents, right? So the Magi show up at the court of Herod the Great. Herod meets with them and tells them where to find the Messiah. They said, Herod tells them, after consulting with the Jewish religious leaders, that you'll find the Messiah in Bethlehem. And he sends the Magi to Bethlehem saying, okay, when you find him, send word back to me so I can come and worship him as well. But that, of course, is Herod lying through his teeth. He intends to murder the legitimate claimant to the throne of Judea, because Herod is a pretender. He's not a legitimate king. He's a Roman appointed king with no Judean blood whatsoever. And this guy's a threat to his throne. And Herod has a track record of murdering members of his own family who had a better claim to the throne than he did. But it all starts with that. Then when the Magi, they go to Bethlehem, they present their gift, singular, three components, singular gift. They present their gift of gold, frankincense, and myrrh to the new, not newborn, but the new king of the Jews. He's about 15 months old at this point in time, according to the chronology that we understand is accurate. But then they are told in a dream not to return to Herod. They don't. Herod is very offended and becomes enraged and sends his soldiers to Bethlehem to murder every male child 2 years and younger. And this is what is known as the Massacre of the Innocents. And see, the skeptics drive a truck through this, because they say, well, that would have been such a significant incident that there's no way it would have been left out of the historical record. Well, that just betrays the fact that they don't really understand how history works, and especially they don't understand how ancient history would have worked. It's actually not surprising at all that it's not in the historical record. And I shouldn't say it that way, from a certain perspective, because it is in the historical record. It's in the Bible, and the Bible is an historical record, despite what the skeptics want to say. The skeptics want to eliminate the Bible as a historical record, and they want to eliminate the Bible as a historical record as a default, which that is really just their bias on display. They want to claim that, well, the Bible is a religious record, therefore it is by definition a biased record, and therefore it's not trustworthy, and therefore we have to eliminate it by default from the start, and therefore we have to seek out other records. We have to search out, quote unquote, secular historical records to find out what really happened. But once again, that betrays their ignorance that the distinction between religious and secular, that's modern. That didn't exist 2,000 years ago during the period that we're looking at. You didn't have, quote unquote, secular historians trying to be objective. Everybody had an agenda, right? And when you cross-reference the different historians at that time, and this is something we're going to talk about as we get deeper into the episode, when you cross-reference the different historians at that time, it is pretty evident that, frankly, all of them had an agenda. Now, you do have to take that into consideration. Make no mistake, when you discover bias on the part of a writer, okay, then you do have to investigate it to try to discover, well, is that bias, or is he maybe simply trying to communicate a certain message to a certain group of people? So that brings you to the question of, you've got to ask who the audience is. Who is the audience of this writer? Because if the audience is a religious group, then it's not really bias. He's writing for a particular group. So that's not really bias. We consider it bias because we are under the mistaken impression of this difference between a secular and a religious work back then. See, and that's a problem. So, but the point being is, the skeptics, they want to claim that the massacre of the innocents didn't happen because there's no, quote unquote, independent record, and that this would have been such a big deal that, well, of course it would have been mentioned. And of course, they're implying that this would have been mentioned in the works of Josephus. That's the implication, is that, oh, well, Josephus surely would have mentioned it. And if Josephus didn't mention it, then, well, that's a real problem. So that just proves that it didn't happen. Well, that is a classic argument from silence, because what we all do this, we all don't like it, is that when we're faced with that silence, we try to fill the silence. And like I said, see, that's actually what historical research is all about, is, okay, when we don't have the evidence that we would like to have, then we've got to fill the silence. We got to fill the blank using the evidence that we do have. Well, this is a classic argument from silence. The massacre of the innocents couldn't have happened because it clearly would have been such a big deal that there's no way it would have been left out. Well, that's not true, right? The first thing we got to realize is that Josephus is writing that Josephus would have written at least 75 years after the fact. So the irony is that maybe he wasn't aware. See, and he was a Jew. He was not a Christian. He was a Jew. So he may have been unfamiliar with the Christian record, the Gospel of Matthew that records it. He may have been completely unaware, right? And then as far as a historical incident is concerned, and I shared this last week, Bethlehem is a small village, only about 400 people, which means the number of male children that were actually killed could have been as little as 4 to 6 to 8, and probably no more than 20 maximum. And then even though Herod himself commonly would make a display of killing his political enemies, we don't know that to be true in this circumstance. Maybe he told his soldiers to keep this one quiet because he was, after all, murdering babies. Okay, or maybe the soldiers themselves decided to keep it quiet because this is pretty ugly. They may have been following orders. They may have been following orders they found repugnant. So maybe they went in there quick and quiet, and it was like, yeah, you know what? We're not going to make a disturbance. Yes, it's going to freak out the inhabitants of Bethlehem. It's going to be very traumatic for them, but to the best of their ability, they're going to keep it quiet. And for example, you have to take note of the fact that John the Baptist is only 6 months older than Jesus. He actually fits the category of 2 years old and younger. He fits that, but he's about 6 miles away in the village of Ein Karem. All right. And apparently that was far enough away that he got by untouched. See? So John the Baptist gets missed by Herod's pogrom, but And then Jesus gets missed because because Joseph gets warned in a dream and they take off and they get out of there, right? But my point being is that it may not have been as massive or as significant, as historically significant as we think it was. So why did Josephus not mention it? Well, I also talk about the fact that Josephus doesn't mention the visit of the Magi at all, and that truly would have been a significant historical incident. So that raises the question, okay, well, why didn't Josephus mention that? Well, there could be reasons. So the last two episodes plus today, they've turned into this very interesting mix of, well, how does historical investigation work? What is an argument from silence? What about the fact that the Massacre of the Innocents is not mentioned by Josephus? What about the fact that the entire visit of the Magi is not mentioned by Josephus? What would the Parthian ambassadorial entourage would have looked like, right? So now what I want to do today is I actually want to go into a deeper investigation of the works of Josephus. Who was he, right? Who was Josephus? Because I'll tell you right now, Josephus is often accused of being either inaccurate or biased or both. But that may be due to the fact that we don't understand what historical investigation looked like at that day and time. We may be superimposing our modern parameters of historical investigation, superimposing them. And this is the problem with the nativity story, is that we tend to look backwards through 2,000 years of tradition or 2,000 years of ever developing historical and scientific methodology that we think is being objective, but is actually coloring our investigation. We think it has to look a certain way because we tell ourselves, well, I'm being scientifically objective and I'm examining the evidence, when in reality, your objectivity may actually be a kind of bias. So this is tricky to investigate the evidence and be aware that there can be bias, but then do our best to peel off the various layers so that we can get as close to the truth as possible, right? Because the simple bottom line here is that ancient history looks different than modern history does. And ancient history even varied from culture to culture. The different authors and the different audiences of the different authors varied. And see, that's what we're running into as well. So that's what I want to talk about. And so I want to talk about this very interesting man, Flavius Josephus, and some of the things he says in his writings that can help clue us into what really would have happened. So we know him as Flavius Josephus, but he would have been born Joseph ben Mattiyahu, Joseph the son of Matthew. Joseph ben Mattiyahu, and he would have been born in 37 CE or 37 AD in Jerusalem, in what would have been at that time the Roman province of Judea. It's no longer the independent kingdom of Judea, it's the Roman province of Judea. Now, he was a Hebrew, and his name would have been Joseph ben Mattiyahu, right? Now, Josephus wrote an autobiography. Now, it's called The Life of Flavius Josephus, right? Now, in academic circles, it's known by its Latin designation, which is vita, and the word vita simply means life in Latin. So therefore, the vita, the life of Flavius Josephus, right? So in academic circles, it's just simply called vita. That's it, right? And then it's abbreviated simply by the letter V. That's it. Right? So if you're trying to get through some of the academic evidence on this, you're going to run into Vita of Flavius Josephus and abbreviated V. But according to his autobiography, Joseph ben Mattiyahu, his father was of priestly descent. He was from a priestly family. Therefore, we have to presume that his father was from the tribe of Levi. And then, according to his autobiography, his mother claimed royal ancestry and is therefore presumably from the tribe of Judah. Okay, so interesting. So, according to Josephus's own testimony about himself from his autobiography, he says, my father's family was priestly family, most likely tribe of Levi. I mean, it's got to be axiomatically, if he's a Jew, if he's a Hebrew, claiming to be from a priestly family, then it's got to be not only from the tribe of Levi, but frankly from a descendant of Aaron, right? And then if his mother is claiming royal ancestry, that's got to be tribe of Judah and house of David. Now, a quick little side note, and then come right back. There were 3 major rebellions by the Jews against the Roman Empire. And these 3 major rebellions were, number 1, the one that is commonly known as the First Jewish-Roman War, also known as the Great Jewish Revolt, or simply the Jewish War. Now, this is the one that most people know about because this is the one where the temple was destroyed by the Romans, and then there was the very famous last stand of the Jewish rebels at the fortress of Masada. So the first Jewish-Roman War took place between 66 and 73 CE. So that's the first one, the first Jewish-Roman War. Now, the second Jewish-Roman War is one that a lot of people are totally unaware of, and therefore it often gets ignored as the second Jewish-Roman War. It's called the Kitos War. It took place from 115 to 117 CE. It's also known as the Rebellion of the Diaspora, right? And this is because although it predominantly took place in Judea, it also took place in other areas around the Roman Empire where the Jews rose up in rebellion against their Roman overlords. And then it's called the Kitos War because it's named after the Roman general Lucius Quietus, right? Quietus or Quietus. And then that gets mangled into Kitos, right? Kitos. Whereas in Latin, it would have been spelled Quietus, but then it gets bastardized into Kitos, Kitos. So it's called the Kitos War, but he's the Roman general that eventually put down the rebellion and defeated the Jews. And that would have been the second Jewish-Roman War, right? But it often gets passed right over. A lot of people aren't even aware of it, right? And then the third Jewish-Roman War, which is better known as the Bar Kokhba Revolt, that occurred between 132 and 136 CE or AD, and it was led by Simon Bar Kokhba, right? Now, this one is a little better known for a couple of reasons. The reason it is a little better known is because Simon Bar Kokhba was regarded by many of his followers as the Messiah. So you've got messianic implications frankly, in all of these rebellions, but this one, their leader claims to be the Messiah, or at least was thought to be the Messiah by many of his followers. And this is what's known as the Third Roman War. And then it's also a little bit better known than the others, I shouldn't say it that way. I should say it is the reason some people know about it, are aware of it, is because when this war was over, the Romans built a Roman colony on the ruins of Jerusalem. They basically flattened Jerusalem at this point, obliterated it entirely, and then built a Roman colony on top of the ruins and called it Colonia Aelia Capitolina. So it's an entirely Latin and entirely Roman colony on top of the remains of Jerusalem. And then in addition, they changed the name of the province of Judea. See, up until then, it would have been Provincia Judea, right? The province of Judea, right? And they changed the name to Syria Palestina. And this was a deliberate insult by the Romans to the Jews, They chose the word Palestina deliberately because Palestina is the Latinized name of Israel's traditional enemy, the Philistines. So by renaming it, they're very deliberately insulting the Jews and saying, we're not even going to call this Judea anymore. We're going to call it Palestine or Palestina. We're going to name it after your enemies, and we're going to build a Roman colony on top of your city and your temple that are now gone, right? So very, very deliberate insult to truly wipe the Jews off the map is what the Romans were doing. Now, I want to put this in perspective because the reason I mentioned the 3 Jewish wars is because Josephus was directly involved in the first one. He was actually in the first Jewish-Roman war, and then he wrote about the first Jewish-Roman war. His predominant works are predominantly about that war, right? And the context under which they were written, and then the audience to which they were written is very important. And this is why I am bringing this up, is because we're talking about the fact that, like I said, when you do historical research, this is the stuff you have to take into account and not simply say, oh, Josephus was biased, or oh, Josephus was incorrect, and then use that as an excuse to invent a reason why it's wrong, and then to insert what you want to see in the gap. See, and that's unfortunately what happens a lot when modern researchers look back at ancient history, is they neglect the fact that ancient history wasn't written according to the same parameters that modern history is, and that therefore, if you try to strictly look at it through these, strictly objective modern context, well, you're actually imposing a bias on the work. See, like I said, if you want to eliminate the religious component of the Bible, well, that's bias, because you really can't. You do have to take it into consideration. That's not wrong. You absolutely have to consider the religious component of the evidence, but if you remove it from the evidence, then you've tampered with the evidence. And this is true whether you're talking about the Gospel of Matthew or whether you're talking about Josephus, right? Because he was a devout Jew, right? So is there a religious component to his writings? Absolutely there is. He's trying to explain to his audience how the temple in Jerusalem could have been destroyed. How did the God of the Jews allow such a thing to happen? That's a big part of what he's trying to explain. So if you try to remove the religious context, then you're destroying the evidence. You're tampering with the evidence and destroying the evidence. Now, we'll get more into that in a second. But likewise, and I mentioned this in the last 2 episodes, I'll mention it again because it's one of my favorite examples. If you try to claim that someone like Julius Caesar was a secular historian, you're wrong. He was not a secular historian. He was, Pontifex Maximus of the Roman religion, which means he was the equivalent of the high priest. Was he biased? Absolutely. Was he biased in favor of the Roman religion? Absolutely. Was he biased in favor of what he was trying to accomplish in Gaul when he wrote the commentaries on the wars of Gaul? Absolutely. Did he write back to the Romans what he wanted them to hear? Yep, absolutely. But that means you take these things into consideration. You don't strip them from the historical record, right? See, and that's, good Lord, I shouldn't go there, but, we see that today with all the statues that are being torn down, statues in the South, statues of the Confederacy, right? Well, you're not correcting the historical record. You're stripping the historical record of its accuracy. It's not offensive to leave those things up. They were left up so that we can always remember. It's better to leave them up with the attitude of never forget. That's the better way of doing it, right? That's the much better way of doing it, is leave that statue up and then teach your children never forget, instead of tearing the statue down. That's just ridiculous. So at any rate, this is what's really important when we do historical investigation, and why I want to teach you a little something about Josephus and who he was and how he wrote, and not only how he wrote, but to whom he wrote, and frankly, even in what language he wrote. Even that is significant, and it really helps us understand God Save the King. Why did he leave certain things out? Why is the massacre of the innocents left out? Right? Why is the visit of the Magi to Herod left out? Because one would think, not entirely illogically, that Josephus would have mentioned such things, but he didn't. So does that mean they didn't happen? No, of course not. That is, like I said, that's a classic argument from silence. That is imposing a reason on the text. It's not looking at the text and going, okay, well, based on the evidence we have, why isn't this there, right? And like I said, when it comes to the massacre of the innocents, at least, he may not have known. He may not have been aware. It's entirely possible he knew no such thing. Entirely possible, right? So who was this guy? Who was Josephus, right? Well, like I said, he was born in 37 AD, 37 CE, Common Era, or Anno Domini, either one, same thing, right? And then during the first Jewish-Roman War that began in 66 CE, he was elected. See, now back then he would have been Yosef ben Mattiyahu. He would not have been Josephus yet. He changed his name later, and we're going to tell you why he changed his name to Latin Flavius Josephus. But at this time, he was a Hebrew, he was a Jew, and he was a general in the Jewish army, and he would have been known as Yosef ben Mattiyahu, right? There it is, right? And he was the general of all Galilee, right? Which is very interesting because, see, that brings up another argument from silence, right? When Josephus writes about the war in Galilee, he never mentions Nazareth. Well, why is that? See, there's another one. There's another argument from silence. He lists off like 35 different cities and villages in Galilee and never mentions Nazareth. Well, why is that? Well, there's a good reason for that. That's in a different episode. We won't go there now. But at any rate, Yosef ben Mattiyahu served as the general of the Judean army in Galilee during the first Jewish-Roman War, which started in 66 CE. Well, and he fortified the region. He had some limited success, but then a siege occurred at the city of, in Greek it would be called Jotapata, right? In Hebrew it would be called Yodfat, right? Yodfat. A siege occurred in this city. The Romans surround it, and they eventually overrun the city. And the Jews lose this battle. There was a 6-week siege that ended in the Romans sacking the town, killing the majority of the inhabitants, and enslaving the remainder. And this includes Yosef ben Mattiyahu. So as the general, he was the one who officially surrendered, and he surrendered to, here you go, here's a hint, he surrendered to Titus, the Roman general, Titus Flavius Vespanius, and he's typically known as Vespasian, right? Vespianus, I should say it, Vespianus, right? Titus Flavius Vespianus, right? Known as Vespasian, right? He's a general at this point, but he will become emperor. And this is important because when Yosef ben Mattiyahu surrenders to Titus Flavius Vespasian, he tells him about the Jewish messianic prophecies that are driving the rebellion. And he also tells him, and thereby in effect prophesies to Vespasian, Joseph ben Metayahu prophesies to Titus Flavius Vespasian that he will become emperor. Oh, very interesting. Very interesting, right? So as a response, Vespasian keeps Joseph ben Matayahu as a slave, doesn't have him executed, keeps him as a slave. And see, then when Vespasian becomes emperor in 69 CE, he grants Joseph ben Matayahu his freedom. And as a result, Joseph ben Matayahu fully defects to the Roman side and assumes the emperor's family name, Flavius, and then translates his Hebrew name, Joseph, into Latin, where it becomes Josephus. So Joseph ben Matayahu becomes Flavius Josephus. He's no longer identifying himself as a Hebrew, even though he is clearly ethnically Hebrew. He's not identifying with the Jews anymore. He has defected and he has gone over to the Roman side, and he's calling himself by a Latin name, Flavius Josephus, and he was given his freedom by Vespasian, right? Now, he then serves in the army of Vespasian's son. Now, Vespasian's son, so the elder Vespasian is Titus Flavius Vespasian. His son is Titus Caesar Vespasian, right? Now, typically, when it's truncated, when you chop it down, the elder Vespasian is simply known as Vespasian. The younger Vespasian is known as Titus Vespasian, right? Now, it's Titus Vespasian. For all of you eschatology nuts out there, it's Titus Vespasian that surrounds Jerusalem in 70 AD and destroys the city. Okay, so that's the record in Luke, and I forget the chapters off the top of my head, but it's the Olivet, what we call the Olivet Discourse, which there's supposed to be parallel records. The record in Matthew 24 and 25 is supposedly a parallel record to the record in Luke. Is it 20 and 21 or 21 and 22? But they're actually not parallel records. There's enough distinction between the two that they are actually independent records. So the one that is in view here is the record in Luke, not the record in Matthew. But the point being here is that Flavius Josephus is serving in the Roman army at this point, but he is serving as a friend and servant and translator to Titus Vespasian. And he tries to persuade the Jews to surrender. And what's interesting, and seeing this is what's important, is now you've got to ask yourself questions. Why? Okay. And see, because the appearance here, of course, is that he has defected to the Romans and that he's a Roman sympathizer. But is he a Roman sympathizer, or is he trying to save his people in the best way he knows how? See, so this is where historical interpretation gets tricky, is, see, one man's patriot is another man's rebel. So which is he? Which is this? Which is he? Is he a rebel or is he a patriot? And for which group? See, because now he is working for the Romans, but it's reasonable to say that at least part of what he's doing is that while, yes, he is working for the Romans, he is trying to prevent the destruction of Jerusalem. He's trying to prevent the destruction of Jerusalem, right? And if you read his record of what happens, he doesn't blame the Romans for the destruction of Jerusalem. He blames the Jews. And because he is a devout Jew and he is a Hebrew and he believes in the God of Abraham and Isaac, he also explains that the reason is because the Jews were a bunch of hardheads and stiff-necked, and instead of saving their city and their temple, they themselves engaged in behavior that that God brought upon them the destruction of the temple and the city. See, so it's really interesting to try to peel these layers back. See, to try to peel these layers away and understand what's going on. Because I'm going to get into this here right now, we're going to talk about who Josephus wrote to. When did he write? What did he write? What language did he write in? And therefore, who was his audience, right? And try to dispel some of this nonsense of trying to be this strictly secular, strictly, what's the word I want to use? Rats. Totally impartial, right? No, you've got to look. You do need to critically examine what's going on. You do need to look at the author and ask these questions. Was the author biased? Okay, yes or no. But if he was biased, why was he biased? What can we glean from the text about why? See, so Josephus, for example, like I just said, he's a devout Jew. He's a believing Jew. He believes in the temple. He's from Jerusalem. He was born in Jerusalem. This is his hometown. And he laments the destruction of the city. And he tells his readers that he laments the destruction of the city. See, and some critics and skeptics look at that and they say, see, he's not being objective. See, he's not being historically objective. He's telling the people that he's biased. Well, wait a second. Isn't telling your readers that you're biased being objective? Right? See, me, I'm a Bible-believing Christian. Am I biased? To a certain degree, yes. I'm endeavoring to be as objective as possible and bring you the evidence for why I believe what I believe, but I also believe that the Bible is a viable historical resource. And that's because it's proven itself to me over and over and over and over again, unlike the skeptics who reject it out of hand. So who's being biased? If you have a secular historian who is rejecting the Bible out of hand, and then you've got a believing historian who says, hey, by the way, I need to tell you up front, I believe the Bible. Okay, which one of us is being objective? Am I the one being objective, or is the secular historian who says, no, we've got to strip it. We can't use it at all because it's not secularized and it's not, okay. Who's doing the better job of being objective and unbiased and doing their best to tell you what happened and then let you make up your mind? Let you make up your mind. Okay, so anyway, so Yosef ben Mattyahu served as a general in the Jewish army in Galilee early in the First Jewish-Roman War. The city that he is defending gets put under siege. They lose. A huge portion of the city gets killed. The rest gets sold into slavery. He becomes a slave because his life is spared by General Vespasian, because he, in effect, prophesies to Vespasian that Vespasian will become emperor, which he does, which gets him his freedom, right? And then he serves for the emperor's son, who is the general Titus Vespasian, at the siege of Jerusalem in 70 BC. He serves as a translator, but he's evidently trying to prevent the destruction of the city. Titus Vespasian doesn't actually want to destroy the city. He doesn't want to destroy it, which is why when Josephus writes, you can discover the perspective that he believes that it's the Jews that were to blame for the destruction of their own temple and their own city at the hands of the Romans, right? Because they went about it all wrong, right? Now, later on, only a few years later, Flavius Josephus, right, is now in Rome. He's back in Rome, and he's writing his first major work. And his first major work is simply called the Jewish War. So that's why the First Jewish-Roman War is sometimes simply called the Jewish War, is because that's what Josephus entitled this book was The Jewish War. Now, several hundred years later, in the 4th century, it was translated into Latin, and therefore the Latin title of this book is Bellum Judaicum. And that is how we see it in academic circles. And I'm letting you know that because if you try to do your own research, you're going to run face first into it being called Bellum Judaicum and then abbreviated BJ, right? So because you'll be reading a work and you'll run across this abbreviation BJ, right? And you'll be like, what the heck is that, right? What is BJ? And it's Bellum Judaicum, the Jewish War, by Flavius Josephus, right? So he published Bellum Judaicum in 75 CE. He would have been 38 years old, okay? Now, it is widely considered, okay, that this first book has some errors in it. And maybe it does, because his second work, okay, which is known as the Antiquities of the Jews, was written 18 years later and published in 93 AD. Okay? And that there's a lot of time in between for him to do a couple of things. Number one, perfect his ability as a historian, but also he became acquainted with certain historical works. This is really critical. He was exposed to other documents that helped him understand better what happened. So therefore, from a certain perspective, it is often looked upon the fact that Antiquities of the Jews is more accurate than Bellum Judaicum, right? Because he had access to the book of First Maccabees, to the Chronicles of the Priesthood of John Hyrcanus, and some other things, and that therefore you have a more accurate work that he may have even made corrections. So now you've got this double implication of, well, was he biased? Well, maybe, but why was he biased? Because he was a faithful Jew after all. And even though he defected to the Romans and became a servant, right? Well, that's a common tale in Jewish history. How many times were the Jews enslaved and yet it didn't put a dent in their faith, right? So what's going on here? What's going on here? See, so when you try to understand this so-called bias, you got to look into the bias. You can't just throw it away because there's bias. You got to look into the bias and ask yourself what's going on, right? Now, but here's the real point I want to get, and we've got just a few minutes left, and this is my primary point. And it affects God Save the King in a couple of different ways, which is that Bellum Judaicum, although it was translated into Latin in the 4th century, it was written in Aramaic. Now, this is according to Josephus' own testimony, where apparently after he wrote it in Aramaic, it became known enough that he believed it was a good idea to translate it into other languages. Wow. Very provocative. Very, very, very provocative, right? And the interesting thing is that the lingua franca, so here we go again. Here's another odd phrase, right? So for those of you that do or do not know what lingua franca is, it's a Latin phrase that simply means the international language or the trade language of the region at the time, right? So if you've got a multicultural empire, which the Roman Empire is, then you have a common language. So like the lingua franca, the worldwide lingua franca today is English, right? It is the trade language of the world, period. It doesn't matter whether you live in Russia or whether you live in China or whether you live in Africa. The lingua franca today, the trade language, is English, right? Well, back then, the lingua franca was Greek. It wasn't Aramaic and it wasn't Latin, although both Aramaic and Latin were the lingua franca in other locations at other times. But in the Roman Empire at this time, Greek would have been the lingua franca. So Josephus determines that it's a good idea to translate Bellum Judaicum, the Latin name, which he wrote in Aramaic into Greek, and he tells us why. In his own work, he writes, he says, I have proposed to myself, for the sake of those that live under the government of the Romans, to translate those books into the Greek tongue, which I formerly composed in the language of our country. Right? Now, it's a little bit convoluted to follow the English translation, but let me say it again. I have proposed, Josephus, I have proposed to myself, for the sake of those who live under the government of the Romans, to translate those books into the Greek tongue, which I formerly composed in the language of our country, meaning Aramaic. So he believed it was a good idea to translate his first book, which was written in Aramaic. See, Antiquities was written in Greek. The book that came 18 years later was written in Greek, but the first book was written in Aramaic. So the point of this, okay, is who is it written to? It's not written to a Roman audience. It's written to a Jewish audience. See, that tells us something. It was written to a Jewish audience. Okay, so that tells us something about it. And even better, he tells us who he writes it to, which is, it says he sent the book. He sent the book, sent it. So it's not for whoever is right around where he lives. It says he sent it to the upper barbarians. And then Josephus himself, and I'm running out of time, so sorry if I got to hurry here. Josephus himself identifies who the upper barbarians are, and the upper barbarians are the Jews that live among, ready, the Parthians. That was who his intended audience was Jews that live among the Parthians. And then, oh yeah, by the way, Parthian is a Semitic language. It has an Aramaic base. So in addition to writing to the Jews who live among the Parthians, he's also writing to the Parthians. So this is really interesting because it means he is keeping the Parthian Empire in mind as he is writing this work, which is why it is so helpful to my research as part of God Save the King to understand the works of Josephus and how they contribute to our understanding. Now, I am completely out of time, so I'm really sorry to rush here. But ladies and gentlemen, that's going to do it for today. I am Tim Keyes of God Save the King. I want to thank you for joining me on the Truth Be Told radio network, where you can hear my show every Friday night at 10 p.m. God Save the King.